Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. The sun is out, the grass is green, the birds are a-chirping, and we're all enjoying ourselves on this lovely day. Given that it's mid-May, we're well past the end of the first quarter of 2023, so I thought today I would talk a little bit about what I've been reading. For those of you new to this segment, the Reading Roundup, I talk about the books that I read in the first quarter, or in the previous quarter of the year, and I guess sometimes I'll talk about the books generally, sometimes I'll talk about if you are going to thematically connect them to a game, what game that might be. I'm not sure how much I'll do that today because I have a lot of books that I've read. A lot of them are comics, so they read quickly, but I also have been reading audiobooks again lately, which means I'm a little more behind on my podcasts. I've had to trim down the podcasts that I'm listening to, but I was finding that the pleasure of the podcast experience was dipping for me a bit. I was finding a little bit less enjoyment in them, and I had kind of forgotten how much I really like audiobooks. And so I installed the incredibly easy to use library audiobook apps, Libby and Hoopla, on my phone, which made it very easy for me to listen to those instead of my podcasts. So I decided that I would listen to 2 audiobooks a month, one somewhere around the 1st and one somewhere around the 15th of the month. And then my podcasts in between, with my goal of not getting further behind on my podcast backlog. So each time I finish an audiobook, I go and look, and if I'm over the line I'm keeping, I delete episodes until I'm caught up. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the stuff I've read. I'll give you a little commentary here or there as I think of it, and we'll see how far we get. I may not get all the way to the end of March. I've read quite a few books this month, or this quarter so far, but I'll do my best. First off, we have The String Bags by Garth Ennis and PJ Holden. This is a sort of comedy war drama about a couple of soldiers who are flying old-time, like World War I era planes in World War II, at the beginning of World War II. It's not clear to me why they're flying the old planes, but they've gotten stuck flying them because the RAF needs every plane they can get, and it's a pretty good war comic. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say other than what I've just said. It's kind of funny in the way that a lot of Garth Ennis comics are funny, meaning that pretty dark and violent, but enjoyable. That's The String Bags. The artist on that is PJ Holden. Next up, I read Gundog by Gary Whitta. This is an audiobook form. Gundog it's a post-apocalyptic war narrative in which aliens came to Earth and enslaved humankind, and we tried to fight back by building basically these big titans, and we lost, but one of the characters escapes and goes and finds a titan and starts causing all manner of trouble. And I'm not sure if there's going to be a follow-up or if there was a sequel to it. I mean, it was just published last July, so it's possible there is going to be a follow-up and it hasn't been published yet. I thought it was pretty good. I mean, entertaining, probably not super memorable, although I do still remember the plot, which, you know, is something. It's been 4 months, so I could very well have forgotten the plot by now if it was entirely unmemorable. But so it was good. Not amazing, but good. Next up, I read Astonishing X-Men Volume 5, Ghost Box. This is a Warren Ellis comic that I think I had because it was a Warren Ellis comic, and I sort of thought it would be readable without having read the other Astonishing X-Men series, but it was not. I couldn't really understand what was going on. It was fine, but I also did not enjoy it enough for me to want to go read more of that. I've also learned Warren Ellis has done some kind of unpleasant things in his personal life that make me less inclined to go read his stuff, which is a bummer. He was a favorite comic writer of mine for a long time. But there are plenty of great writers to read whose personal lives don't make me unhappy. So the next up was The Death of Mrs. Westaway by Ruth Ware. Ruth Ware is an excellent suspense writer, and this one was an excellent novel. In this one, you have a young woman who was raised by a single mother and who is contacted by a contacted by a lawyer because she has the same name as the long lost granddaughter of this very wealthy woman. And even though this main character knows for certain she can't be the child of this old woman, she's desperately poor, and it seems like there's a chance she's going to get some money out of the will. So she decides to pretend to be this long lost granddaughter and go anyway. Ruth Ware is very good at writing tension-filled, very emotionally driven mystery books, and I would say this one really shines. It reminded me a little bit of Thomas Cook, if you've read any of his stuff. Has a similar kind of tension or feeling to it. Definitely worth recommending worth checking out if you get a chance. The Death of Mrs. Westaway. I read the comic The Trial of Sherlock Holmes. These are from the Leah Moore Sherlock Holmes comics that she's been writing. Honestly, I don't even remember the plot. I thought it was pretty good. I rated it 4 stars, so I must have enjoyed it, but I don't remember it. The Company of the Dead was an interesting one. This is an alternate history story in which the Germans won World War I, and the United States broke up into it was World War II, excuse me. Germans won World War II, and they divided America up into German territory and Japanese territory. Or actually, no, all of America was Japanese territory, because America then, in the midst of the fighting, had a revolution as well, and the South broke away and became the new Confederacy, which of course is horrible. And then in the context of this, you have these characters who are playing around with a time travel device, trying to figure out how to put the world in a different path, not knowing that in fact had already been changed once into this divergent and unpleasant path. And of course, the center point of the divergence, and the reason I picked the novel up to begin with, is shenanigans on the Titanic. Titanigans? Whatever. This was fine. It was a little convoluted and too long, but I enjoyed it. And any kind of time travel story I like. I'm not really big on alternate pasts or alternate histories, but it was fine. 3 stars. Next up, we have Hidden Figures, the untold story of the African American women who helped with the space program. This was an excellent book. It is the book on which the movie was based, although it's much more detailed than the film. I watched the film. It was good, but it was sort of like the Cliff's Notes of the book. The book had much more detail about the different women featured in the movie and the lives that they led as they made their way through a slightly more progressive institution than the rest of the world was at the time, but still had to fight an awful lot of discrimination and unpleasantness. Nonetheless, it's ultimately a hopeful book and really uplifting and interesting. Definitely worth checking out if you get a chance. I really liked that. That's Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly, and that was 4 stars. Next up, we had Doug Tenapel's graphic novel Creature Tech. This is one I got a long time ago, I think on a discount shelf. And I picked it up because it just looked weird, and it turned out, yeah, it's really weird. The premise of this one is that there is a set of technologies that are being hoarded by a secret government agency that have been stolen from, I think, aliens or perhaps from the Russians. And we have like a big pile of them, and for a long time, there was a scientist whose job it was to investigate these secret technologies. Then they got fired, and for a long time they sat dormant, and now this new guy was picked to go investigate these technologies. And the first one he finds is a weird parasite that attaches to his body, and he becomes like this weird hybrid person. And of course, then other trouble starts as well, and he has to fight them. It's a fun romp, really weird, delightfully drawn. Not a whole lot to write home about after the story is done. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I'm not going to keep it. In fact, I think I already donated it away, but it was enjoyable while it lasted. That's Creature Tech by Doug Tenapel. I gave that 3 stars. The next one I got was a graphic novel called Bury the Lead by Gabby Dunn, art by Clara Rowe. This is a comic book with a sort of reporter angle to it. A good journalism thriller, well written and interesting to read. That's Bury the Lead, 4 stars. Next up, I read Zoe's Tale, which is a John Scalzi novel in the Old Man's War universe. Now, I did read the original Old Man's War a while ago, and I did not realize that it was an ongoing series. And I found Zoe's Tale as an available book on Hoopla. And so I just got it without really looking into it. And I read it and it was very enjoyable, but I was about a quarter of the way in. I'm like, oh dang, this is definitely not the next book in the series. I went and looked, sure enough, it's book 4. And I'd only read book 1. And it turned out they were not entirely linear, but pretty linear. So reading that book was interesting and fun, and I liked it quite a bit, but it was hard to make sense of it. Nonetheless, I really enjoyed it. 4 stars, Zoe's Tale. Then I went back and checked out the other John Scalzi Old Man's Tale novels, starting with The Ghost Brigades, which was the second one. And this was really good, very enjoyable, and of course informed some of the stuff that shows up in Zoe's Tale. Helped me understand what's going on there. If you've read Old Man's War, I recommend all of these. They're really good. They capture a lot of the same spirit. Scalzi has such a funny writing voice, but also a good sense of character development. None of these books are all that serious, but really interesting. I also really like, in the Old Man's War universe, human beings are one of many races that are sort of fighting for control of the galaxy, and the military division that runs the colonies and the outward expansion of space from Earth is pretty corrupt and borderline fascist, without the ideological racism that's been part of most fascist movements. But it's certainly militaristic and brooks no dissent, and also incredibly manipulative. But I think the book develops that in an organic way that works really well. So an excellent one. The Last Colony. And this is one where they're really wrestling with the question of, like, what does it mean to be a person? What happens if a person is transferred from one body to another, etc., etc. Or that's The Ghost Brigades. Then I read The Last Colony, which is another John Scalzi one. I finished this in early March. This is the 3rd book in the Old Man War series. I sort of figured, like, I might as well just dive into it and get as much as I can done with it. This one tells the story of a new colony being formed as part of a military operation, and our main characters are stuck right in the middle of it and ultimately get very mad that they're being manipulated this way. The Last Colony also provides a really interesting counterpoint to Zoe's Tale. Right? If you're reading Zoe's Tale as the 4th book, it explains a lot of what's going on in the 3rd book, but it is a parallel story. So I could enjoy the 3rd book quite a bit, even though I'd read the 4th book. Honestly, I think they probably work better read in the other order. But The Last Colony, very good. Not quite, I gave it 3 stars, not 4. Then I read The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This is, again, it's an audiobook. This is a book I'd read before. I'm not sure why I wanted to return to it. It's an awful lot of, like, walking and chasing. It's this gunslinger who's chasing kind of the devil, and it's kind of the whole book. It's pretty good, or well written anyway. Ultimately, I'm not sure how much I enjoyed it. I have given myself the task of reading the 2nd book in the Dark Tower series. There's 7 of them. I'm gonna read the 2nd one and see if I like it better. See if it grabs me. If it does, I'll read the rest of the series. If not, I'm probably gonna be done. Even though I have friends who swear by it and think the Dark Tower is the bee's knees, I'm not committed yet. Then I have a number of Warhammer 40,000 novels. And graphic novels. I'm going to read you all the titles of them just so you can see. I read The Priests of Mars by Graham McNeill, Assault on Blackreach by Nick Kime. I liked Graham McNeill's writing quite a bit, and so I sought out some other stuff he wrote. I read the comic Warhammer 40,000, Marneus Calgar, which is the story of a ultramarine leader, which was pretty good. And then I read a couple more Graham McNeill novels. I read Nightbringer, and I read Warriors of Ultramar. Now these are all in the same series and about the same characters with sort of evolving stories. And McNeill does a really nice job of giving us a well-rounded story, even in this kind of decadent and one-note universe. And I've really appreciated that. So I enjoyed those novels quite a bit. I read the MC Beaton novel, Death of a Dreamer. That's like all the MC Beaton novels. I read the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles graphic novel, The Last Ronin, which is sort of like the end of the cycle of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Still written by Eastman and Laird, so still pretty good. I didn't like it as much as other people seem to, but I thought it was fine. And then finally, I read The Nice House on the Lake, which was an amazing graphic novel with a really bizarre horror twist or horror theme and idea. It's hard. I mean, it's got a kind of Lovecraftian cosmic horror element to it. It is not Lovecraftian per se, but it has that same feel. It is dark and twisted and funny and really well drawn. And I highly recommend both volumes 1 and 2. That's by James Tinian IV. And volumes 1 and 2 I gave 5 stars, which is the only 5-star ratings I gave in the quarter. And finally, I read How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu. I gave this 3 stars. It was fine, and I can see why people really liked it, but ultimately, I spent too much of the book kind of trying to struggle to move forward because I was having trouble grasping the story of it, which is kind of the intent, but still didn't work for me. So that's How to Live Safely in the Science Fictional Universe. Well, I hope that you aren't too disappointed that there was not more game content. It is the end of the semester and the end of the quarter, and I felt like talking about books. So that's what I did. I talked about books. What have you been reading lately? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share your last quarter's reading. I'd love to hear if you've read any of the books I read, what kinds of books you've been reading, and so on. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.